Yo soy el pato, tú eres la pata, que en el estanque suele cazar. Ven acá ingrata, nada que nada sin descansar. Cuando el pato se muestra ingrato, la pata suele moverse así, hasta que tierno y enamorado le dice el pato con frenesí.
Hey everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each episode we read about 30 minutes of history together, and we are reading chapter 12 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Shall we dig in? Americans began taking over railroad, mine, and sugar companies when the war ended. In a few years, $30 million of American capital was invested. United Fruit moved into Cuban's sugar industry. It bought 1,900,000 acres of land for about 20 cents an acre. The American Tobacco Company arrived. By the end of the occupation, in 1901, Foner estimates that at least 80% of the export of Cuba's minerals were in American hands, mostly Bethlehem steel. During the military occupation, a series of strikes took place. In September 1899, a gathering of thousands of workers in Havana launched a general strike for the 8-hour day, saying, "We have determined to promote the struggle between the worker and the capitalist. For the workers of Cuba will no longer tolerate remaining in total subjection." The American General William Ludlow ordered the mayor of Havana to arrest 11 strike leaders, and U.S. troops occupied railroad stations and docks. Police moved through the city, breaking up meetings, but the economic activity of the city had come to a halt. Tobacco workers struck. Printers struck. Bakers went on strike. Not the bakers. How will I get my cheesecake? Hundreds of strikers were arrested, and some of the imprisoned leaders were intimidated into calling for an end to the strike. The United States did not annex Cuba, but a Cuban Constitutional Convention was told that the United States Army would not leave Cuba until the Platt Amendment, passed by Congress in February 1901, was incorporated into the new Cuban Constitution. This amendment gave the United States the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. It also provided for the United States to get coaling or naval stations at certain specified points. Excuse me. The Teller Amendment and the talk of Cuban freedom before and during the war had led many Americans and Cubans to expect genuine independence. The Platt Amendment was now seen, not only by the radical and labor press, but by newspapers and groups all over the United States, as a betrayal. A mass meeting of the American Anti-Imperialist League at Fenway Hall in Boston denounced it. Ex-Governor George Boutwell saying, "In disregard of our pledge of freedom and sovereignty to Cuba, we are imposing on that island conditions of colonial vassalage." In Havana, a torchlight procession of 15,000 Cubans marched on the Constitutional Convention, urging them to reject the amendment. But General Leonard Wood, head of the occupation forces, assured McKinley, "The people of Cuba lend themselves readily to all sorts of demonstrations and parades, and little significance should be attached to them." A committee was delegated by the Constitutional Convention to reply to the United States' insistence that the Platt Amendment be included in the Constitution. The committee report, Ponencia a la Convención, was written by a black delegate from Santiago. It said, in English, for the United States to reserve to itself the power to determine when this independence was threatened and when, therefore, it should intervene to preserve it is equivalent to handing over the keys to our house so that they can enter it at any time whenever the desire seizes them, day or night, whether with good or evil designs. And why does he separate it with an and? And the only Cuban governments that would the only Cuban governments that would live would be those which count on the support and benevolence of the United States, and the clearest result of this situation would be that we would only have feeble and miserable governments, condemned to live more attentive to obtaining the blessings of the United States than to serving and defending the interests of Cuba. The report termed the request for coaling or naval stations a mutilation of the fatherland. It concluded, a people occupied militarily is being told that before consulting their own government, before being free in their own territory, they should grant the military occupants who came as friends and allies rights and powers which would annul the sovereignty of these very people. That is the situation created for us by the method which the United States has just adopted. It could not be more obnoxious and inadmissible. With this report, the convention overwhelmingly rejected the Platt Amendment. Within the next 3 months, however, the pressure from the United States, the military occupation, the refusal to allow the Cubans to set up their own government until they acquiesced had its effect. The convention, after several refusals, adopted the Platt Amendment. General Leonard Wood wrote in 1901 to Theodore Roosevelt, "There is of course little or no independence left Cuba under the Platt Amendment." Cuba was thus brought into the American sphere, but not as an outright colony. However, the Spanish-American War did lead to a number of direct annexations by the United States. Puerto Rico, a neighbor of Cuba in the Caribbean, belonging to Spain, was taken over by U.S. military forces. The Hawaiian Islands, 1/3 of the way across the Pacific, which had already been penetrated by American missionaries and pineapple plantation owners, and had been described by American officials as a ripe pear ready to be plucked, was annexed by joint resolution of Congress in July of 1898. You hear that, Hawaii? You're a pear ready to be plucked. Or at least you were 100 years ago. 120 years ago. Around the same time, Wake Island, 2,300 miles west of Hawaii on the route to Japan, was occupied, and Guam, the Spanish possession in the Pacific almost all the way to the Philippines, was taken. In December of 1898, the peace treaty was signed with Spain, officially turning over to the United States Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines for a payment of $20 million. There was heated argument in the United States about whether or not to take the Philippines. As one story has it, President McKinley told a group of ministers visiting the White House how he came to his decision. Before you go, I would like to say just a word about the Philippine business. The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines, and when they came to us as a gift from the gods, I did not know what to do with them. I sought counsel from all sides, Democrats as well as Republicans, but got little help. I thought first we would only take Manila, then Luzon, then other islands perhaps also. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. Sorry, not funny. That we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. 2, that we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. Number 3, that we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. And they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there, worse than Spain's was. And 4, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. And that was President McKinley, to all you Filipinos out there who want to know who to hate. The Filipinos did not get the same message from God. That's what he wrote. In February 1899, they rose in revolt against American rule, and they had rebelled several times against the Spanish. Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino leader who had earlier been brought back from China by U.S. warships to lead soldiers against Spain, now became leader of the insurrectos fighting the United States. He proposed Filipino independence within a U.S. protectorate, but this was rejected. Hold on. Oh no, you can't have independence because you don't know how to govern. You'll ruin it. But we all know that's not the real reason. It took the United States 3 years to crush the rebellion, using 70,000 troops, 4 times as many as were landed in Cuba, and thousands of battle casualties, many times more than in Cuba. It was a harsh war. For the Filipinos, the death rate was enormous from battle casualties and from disease. The taste of empire was on the lips of politicians and business interests throughout the country now. Racism, paternalism, and talk of money mingled with talk of destiny and civilization. In the Senate, Albert Beveridge spoke. Yes, that's really his name, and it's spelled differently. January 9th, 1900, for the dominant economic and political interests of the country. Mr. President, the times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God of the civilization of the world. Good grief. The Pacific is our ocean. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. The Philippines give us a base at the door of all the East. No land in America surpasses in fertility the plains and valleys of Luzon. Rice and coffee, sugar and coconuts, hemp and tobacco. The wood of the Philippines can supply the furniture of the world for a century to come. At Cebu, the best informed man on the island told me that 40 miles of Cebu's mountain chain are practically mountains of coal. I have a nugget of pure gold picked up in its present form on the banks of a Philippine creek. My own belief is that there are not 100 men among them who comprehend what Anglo-Saxon self-government even means, and there are over 5 million people to be governed. It has been charged that our conduct of the war has been cruel. Senators, it has been the reverse. Senators must remember that we are not dealing with Americans or Europeans. We are dealing with Orientals. This makes me want to apologize to the whole rest of the world on behalf of my country. The fighting with the rebels began, McKinley said, when the insurgents attacked American forces. But later, American soldiers testified that the United States had fired the first shot. After the war, an Army officer speaking in Boston's Faneuil Hall said his colonel had given him orders to provoke a conflict with the insurgents. Could this be America's first false flag? Oh no, this is after the Cuban War, so it would have to be the second. In February 1899, a banquet took place in Boston to celebrate the Senate's ratification of the peace treaty with Spain. President McKinley himself had been invited by the wealthy textile manufacturer W.B. Plunkett to speak. It was the biggest banquet in the nation's history. 2,000 diners, 400 waiters. McKinley said that no imperial designs lurk in the American mind. And at the same banquet, to the same diners, his Postmaster General, Charles Emery Smith, said that what we want is a market for our surplus. William James, the Harvard philosopher, wrote a letter to the Boston Transcript about the cold pot grease of McKinley's cant at the recent Boston banquet, and said the Philippine operation reeked of the infernal adroitness of the great department store, which has reached perfect expertness in the art of killing silently and with no public squalling or commotion the neighboring small concerns. James was part of a movement of prominent American businessmen, politicians, and intellectuals who formed the Anti-Imperialist League in 1898 and carried on a long campaign to educate the American public about the horrors of the Philippine War and the evils of imperialism. It was an odd group. Andrew Carnegie belonged, including anti-labor aristocrats and scholars united in a common moral outrage at what was being done to the Filipinos in the name of freedom. And those air quotes were mine, not Howard Zinn's. Not that it matters. Whatever their differences on other matters, they would all agree with William James's angry statement, "God damn the U.S. for its vile conduct in the Philippine Isles." The Anti-Imperialist League published the letters of soldiers doing duty in the Philippines. A captain from Kansas wrote, "Caloocan was supposed to contain 17,000 inhabitants. The 20th Kansas swept through it, and now Caloocan contains not one living native." A private from the same outfit said he had with my own hand set fire to over 50 houses of Filipinos after the victory at Caloocan. Women and children were wounded by our fire. To all of my Filipino friends, I'm sorry. It makes me sick. A volunteer from the state of Washington wrote, "Our fighting blood was up and we all wanted to kill N-words. This shooting human beings beats rabbit hunting all to pieces." It was a time of intense racism in the United States. In the years between 1889 and 1903, on the average, every week, 2 Negroes were lynched by mobs, hanged, burned, mutilated. The Filipinos were brown-skinned, physically identifiable, strange-speaking, and strange-looking to Americans. To the usual indiscriminate brutality of war was thus added the factors of racial hostility. In November 1901, the Manila correspondent of the Philadelphia Ledger reported, "The present war is no bloodless opera buffet engagement. Our men have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners and captives, active insurgents, and suspected people from lads of 10 up. The idea prevailing that the Filipino as such was little better than a dog. Our soldiers have pumped salt water into men to make them talk, and have taken prisoners people who held up their hands and peacefully surrendered, and an hour later, with an atom of evidence to show that they were even insurrectos, stood them on a bridge and shot them down one by one, to drop into the water below and float down as examples to those who found their bullet-loaded corpses." Early in 1901, an American general returning to the United States from southern Luzon said, "1/6 of the natives of Luzon have either been killed or have died of the dengue fever in the last few years. The loss of life by killing alone has been very great, but I think, meaning big, but I think not one man has been slain except where his death has served the legitimate purposes of war. It has been necessary to adopt what in other countries would probably be thought harsh measure." Oh. Secretary of War Elihu Root responded to the charges of brutality. "The war in the Philippines has been conducted by the American Army with scrupulous regard for the rules of civilized warfare, with self-restraint and with humanity never surpassed." And all I'm thinking about right now is like our last, 4 presidents, and they're, making war here or making war there. And I don't want to talk about specifics, but it was a surgical strike, right? We hit exactly who, and no civilian casualties, and it's all a lie. In Manila, a Marine named Littletown Waller, a major, was accused of shooting 11 defenseless Filipinos without trial on the island of Samar. Other Marine officers described his testimony. The major said that General Smith instructed him to kill and burn, and said that the more he killed and burned, the better pleased he would be, that it was no time to take prisoners, and that he was to make Samar a howling wilderness. Major Waller asked General Smith to define the age limit for killing, and he replied, "Everything over 10. In the province of Batangas, the secretary of the province estimated that of the population of 300,000, 1/3 had been killed by combat, famine, or disease. Mark Twain commented on the Philippine War. "We have perceived some thousands of the islanders and buried them, destroyed their fields, burned their villages, and turned their widows and orphans out of doors, furnished heartbreak by exile to some dozens of disagreeable patriots, subjugated the remaining 10 millions by benevolent assimilation, which is the pious new name of the musket. We have acquired property in the 300 concubines and other slaves of our business partner, the Sultan of Sulu, the Sultan of Sulu, and hoisted our protecting flag over that swag. And so, by these providences of God, and the phrase is the government's, not mine, we are a world power. American firepower was overwhelmingly superior to anything the Filipino rebels could put together. In the very first battle, Admiral Dewey steamed up the Pasig River and fired 500-pound shells into the Filipino trenches. Dead Filipinos were piled so high that the Americans used their bodies for breastworks. A British witness said, "This is not war, it is simply massacre and murderous butchery." He was wrong. It was war. For the rebels to hold out against such odds for years meant that they had the support of the population. General Arthur MacArthur, really? General MacArthur's first name was Arthur? General Arthur MacArthur, commander of the Filipino War, said, "I believed that Aguinaldo's troops represented only a faction. I did not like to believe that the whole population of Luzon, the native population that is, was opposed to us." But he said he was reluctantly compelled to believe this because the guerrilla tactics of the Filipino army depended upon almost complete unity of action of the entire native population. Despite the growing evidence of brutality in the work of the anti-imperialist league, some of the trade unions in the United States supported the action in the Philippines. The typographical union said it liked the idea of annexing more territory because English language schools in those areas would help the printing trade. The publication of the glassmakers saw value in new territories that would buy glass. The railroad brotherhoods saw shipments of U.S. goods to the new territories, meaning more work for railroad workers. Some unions repeated what big business was saying, that territorial expansion by creating a market for surplus goods would prevent another depression. On the other hand, when the Leather Workers Journal wrote that an increase in wages at home would solve the problem of surplus by creating more purchasing power inside the country, the Carpenters Journal asked, how much better off are the working men of England through all its colonial possessions? The National Labor Tribune, publication of the iron, steel, and tin workers, agreed that the Philippines were rich with resources, but added, the same can be said of this country, but if anybody were to ask you if you owned a coal mine, a sugar plantation, or a railroad, you would have to say no. All those things are in the hands of the trusts controlled by a few. When the Treaty for Annexation of the Philippines was up for debate in Congress in early 1899, the central labor unions of Boston and New York opposed it. There was a mass meeting in New York against annexation. The Anti-Imperialist League circulated more than 1 million pieces of literature against taking the Philippines. Foner says that while the League was organized and dominated by intellectuals and business people, a large part of its 500,000 members were working class people, including women and blacks. Locals of the League held meetings all over the country. The campaign against the treaty was a powerful one, and when the Senate did ratify it, it was by 1 vote. The mixed reactions of labor to the war, lured by economic advantage, yet repelled by capitalist expansion and violence, ensured that labor could not unite either to stop the war or to conduct class war against the system at home. The reactions of black soldiers to the war were also mixed. There was the simple need to get ahead in a society where opportunities for success were denied the black man, and the military life gave such possibilities. there was race pride, the need to show that blacks were as courageous, as patriotic as anyone else. And yet there was, with all this, the consciousness of a brutal war fought against colored people, a counterpart of the violence committed against black people in the United States. Willard Gatewood, in his book Smoked Yankees and the Struggle for Empire, Smoked Yankees, reproduces and analyzes 114 letters to Negro newspapers written by black soldiers in the period 1898 to 1902. The letters show all those conflicting emotions. Black soldiers encamped in Tampa, Florida, ran into bitter race hatred by white inhabitants there, and then after they fought with distinction in Cuba, Negroes were not rewarded with officers' commissions. White officers commanded black regiments. Negro soldiers in Lakeland, Florida, pistol-whipped a drugstore owner when he refused to serve one of them, and then in a confrontation with a white crowd, killed a civilian. I'm sure that didn't go well for him. In Tampa, a race riot began when drunken white soldiers used a Negro child as a target to show their marksmanship. Negro soldiers retaliated, and then the streets ran red with Negro blood. According to press dispatches. 27 Negro soldiers and 3 whites were severely wounded. The chaplain of a black regiment in Tampa wrote to the Cleveland Gazette, "Is America any better than Spain? Has she not subjects in her very midst who are murdered daily without a trial of judge or jury? Has she not subjects in her own borders whose children are half fed and half clothed because their father's skin is black? Yet the Negro is loyal to his country's flag." The same chaplain, George Priolo, talks of black veterans of the Cuban War unkindly and sneeringly received in Kansas City, Missouri. He says that these black boys, heroes of our country, were not allowed to stand at the counters of restaurants and eat a sandwich and drink a cup of coffee, while the white soldiers were welcomed and invited to sit down at the tables and eat free of cost. But it was the Filipino situation that aroused many blacks in the United States to militant opposition to war. The senior bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Henry M. Turner, called the campaign in the Philippines an unholy war of conquest and referred to the Filipinos as sable patriots. There were 4 black regiments on duty in the Philippines. Many of the black soldiers established rapport with the brown-skinned natives on the islands and were angered by the term N-word used by white troops to describe the Filipinos. An unusually large number of black troops deserted during the Philippines campaign. Gatewood says, the Filipino rebels often addressed themselves to the colored American soldier in posters reminding them of lynchings back home, asking them not to serve the white imperialist against other colored people. Some deserters joined the Filipino rebels. The most famous of these was David Fagan of the 24th Infantry. According to Gatewood, he accepted a commission in the insurgent army and for 2 years wreaked havoc upon the American forces. From the Philippines, William Sims wrote, "I was struck by a question a little Filipino boy asked me, which ran about this way. Why does the American Negro come? To fight us where we are much a friend to him and have not done anything to him. He is all the same as me, and me is all the same as you. Why don't you fight those people in America who burn Negroes that make a beast of you? Another soldier's letter of 1899. Our racial sympathies would naturally be with the Filipinos. They are fighting manfully for what they conceive to be their best interests, but we cannot for the sake of sentiment turn our backs upon our own country. Patrick Mason, a sergeant in the 24th Infantry, wrote to the Cleveland Gazette, which had taken a strong stand against annexation of the Philippines. Dear Sir, I have not had any fighting to do since I have been here, and I don't care to do any. I feel sorry for these people and all that have come under the control of the United States. I don't believe they will be justly dealt by. The first thing in the morning is the N-word, and the last thing at night is the N-word. You are right in your opinions. I must not say much, as I am a soldier. A black infantryman named William Fulbright wrote from Manila in June 1901 to the editor of a paper in Indianapolis. This struggle on the islands has been naught but a giant scheme of robbery and oppression. Back home, while the war against the Filipinos was going on, a group of Massachusetts Negroes addressed a message to President McKinley. We, the colored people of Massachusetts, in mass meeting assembled, have resolved to address ourselves to you in an open letter, notwithstanding your extraordinary, your incomprehensible silence on the subject of our wrongs. You have seen our sufferings, witnessed from your high place our awful wrongs and miseries, and yet you have at no time and on no occasion opened your lips on our behalf. With one accord, with an anxiety that wrenched our hearts with cruel hopes and fears, the colored people of the United States turned to you when Wilmington, North Carolina was held for 2 dreadful days and nights in the clutch of a bloody revolution, when Negroes guilty of no crime except the color of their skin and a desire to exercise the rights of their American citizenship were butchered like dogs in the streets of that ill-fated town for want of federal aid which you would not and did not furnish. It was the same thing with that terrible ebullition of mob spirit at Phoenix, South Carolina, when black men were hunted and murdered and white men, these were white radicals in Phoenix, shot and driven out of that place by a set of white savages. We looked in vain for some word or some act from you. And when you made your southern tour a little later, and we saw how cunningly you catered to southern race prejudice, how you preached patience, industry, moderation to your long-suffering black fellow citizens, and patriotism, jingoism, and imperialism to your white ones. The patience, industry, and moderation preached to blacks, the patriotism preached to whites did not fully sink in. In the first years of the 20th century, despite all the demonstrated power of the state, large number of blacks, whites, men, women became impatient, immoderate, unpatriotic. Thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the reading, and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified each time I make a new video. And YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people, so that's another good reason to hit that notification bell. See you next time. Thank you.